Today, we're cracking open a really fascinating piece by the philosopher Bertrand Russell. Back in 1935, he took a hard look at one of the biggest intellectual battles ever, the long clash between religious authority and scientific inquiry.
So, why have these two huge forces in human history been at war so often? I mean, that's the big question, right? It's the one Russell really sinks his teeth into, and we're going to unpack his answer.
All right, let's get into the weeds here. For Russell, this wasn't just, a few isolated disagreements. No, he saw it as this massive, ongoing conflict, a real, fundamental clash between two totally different ways of even thinking about the world. And this is where Russell really lays out the core of the problem. On one side, you've got what he calls creedal religion. It's all based on authority, the church, the Bible, what have you. It claims to have the absolute, final, divinely revealed truth. But then, on the other side, you've got science. And science is totally different. It's built on observation and evidence, and its theories are always tentative. I mean, a scientific truth could be completely disproven tomorrow if new evidence comes along.
So what you've got is this huge divide in method. Think about it. Theology, in Russell's view, starts with the answer already in hand, these big principles from sacred texts, and then it works its way down. Science does the complete opposite. It starts with a question, looks at specific, observable facts, and builds its theories up from there. You can see how these two different ways of thinking were pretty much destined to clash, right?
Okay, so that brings us to the first major battleground that Russell points to, and it's a big one, the heavens themselves, our whole understanding of the cosmos.
For, more than 1,000 years, the idea that Earth was the center of the universe wasn't just a scientific model, it was absolute religious doctrine. Then this guy, Copernicus, comes along and very carefully suggests, hey, maybe the sun is at the center. But the real fireworks started with Galileo, because he didn't just have a theory, he had a telescope and he had evidence. And this was a total game changer. Galileo wasn't just scribbling equations anymore. He pointed his telescope up and he saw moons going around Jupiter. That proved right there that not everything orbited the Earth. And when you add in the phases of Venus and spots on the sun, well, the old model just started to fall apart. Suddenly, this wasn't some abstract philosophical debate. It was about things you could see with your own eyes.
So, what was the reaction from the powers that be? Did they rush to look through the telescope themselves? Nope. They went back to their books, to scripture. Instead of debating the evidence, they just shut it down. They declared the whole idea heretical. And this moment just perfectly captures the whole conflict, doesn't it? You have Galileo saying, hey, look at the evidence, look through the telescope. And then you have the Inquisition saying, nope, look at the scripture, this is what's true. It was a head-on collision between two totally different ways of deciding what's real. All right, so the battle for the heavens was just the beginning. According to Russell, the conflict then moved from the distant stars right into our own backyard. The next big fight? The origin of life, and of us. Believe it or not, for a very long time, this was the answer to when did the world begin? 4004 BC. An archbishop named Ussher actually calculated it by adding up all the genealogies in the Bible. It wasn't a metaphor. It was treated as a specific historical fact. But then, things started to get complicated. Geologists started finding rocks that suggested the Earth was way older. And then, of course, came Darwin and the theory of evolution. And this wasn't just about changing a date on a calendar. This was a direct challenge to the entire story of Genesis, to the idea that species never change, and to the deeply held belief that humanity was a special, unique creation. And the backlash was, well, it was huge. This quote here actually comes from Russell's own tutor, and it really shows you the mood of the time. It felt like you couldn't be both. You had to choose, Darwin or God. The new science just seemed to be on a collision course with traditional faith. So, we've gone from the stars to the origin of our species, and now Russell takes us to the most intimate battleground of all, the human body itself, the fight over what causes disease and how we get better. For hundreds of years, when people got sick, they didn't really think of it as a biological thing. It was seen as a spiritual issue. Maybe it was a punishment for sin, or maybe demons were involved. So naturally, the treatment wasn't medicine. It was prayer, pilgrimages, maybe even an exorcism. Now, this created a huge problem for the scientific method, because the simple act of, looking inside a human body to figure out how it works, that was considered sacrilege by some.
Guys like Vesalius, who were pioneers in anatomy and dissection, faced serious hostility because they were seen as violating the sanctity of the body, challenging religious dogma.
And again, this wasn't some abstract academic debate. Russell makes it clear that this had real-world consequences. Major medical breakthroughs, things that saved lives, were actually opposed on theological grounds. Inoculation against smallpox? Some saw that as interfering with God's judgment. Using anesthesia to relieve the pain of childbirth, that was condemned because it went against the biblical curse on Eve. It's pretty wild to think about. Okay, so we've followed this thread through the cosmos, through the story of life, right down to the human body. So where does that leave us? What's the bottom line for Bertrand Russell after looking at all this history? Well, Russell's conclusion is pretty direct. He basically says that in this long war between science and religion, science has always won. Every single time religion made a specific claim about how the physical world works, whether it was about the planets, the age of the Earth, you name it, it was eventually forced to back down in the face of scientific evidence.
He saw this clear, undeniable pattern. Science's territory just kept expanding. It was like an expanding frontier. Piece by piece, the things that were once explained by theology, from the stars to our own bodies, were claimed by science. Observation and experiment just kept replacing dogma.
So in the end, Russell's point is that theology didn't win these fights over facts. It survived by changing the rules. When the scientific evidence just became too overwhelming to ignore, inconvenient parts of the Bible were reinterpreted. They became allegories or metaphors, and religion sort of retreated into a new territory, the realm of morals, values, and meaning, leaving the world of testable facts to science. And that's pretty much where Russell's analysis ends. But here's the thing. He wrote all this back in 1935. That was a long time ago. So it kind of leaves us with a really important question, one for you to think about. Is that dynamic of conflict he described still the main story? Or in the time since, have science and religion found new ways to conflict? Or maybe even to cooperate in the search for truth?